I'm Sam Dwyer with the nonprofit Humanities Montana.
And I'm Julie Biondo Edwards, a librarian in Montana and a speaker with Humanities Montana.
And we're here to tell you kind of two different things. First, Humanities Montana's program, Speakers in the Schools. And that's kind of the general overarching program that's available for free to any teachers in the state of Montana. And then in that program, there are a bunch of different topics, 57 different speakers who can come into your classroom and work with students, having conversations and workshops in the humanities, which includes, history, literature, Indian education for all. We have our Poets Laureate are part of our speakers program, so it's a pretty wide-ranging program. And one piece of it is media literacy. And Julie is really our star for our media literacy programs. So today, part of what we're going to do is she is going to give an example of one of the types of programs she can do in the classroom. So this is real content, not just a promotion for speakers in the schools.
Great. So I'm going to talk today about lateral reading, and I'll give you a little bit of background before we move into the example. So I'll start with a story. So in 2016, researchers from Stanford University published this paper, and it showed that students from middle school through high school through undergraduates at Stanford had a really hard time understanding their online information environment. So, for example, they couldn't determine who was behind information. They couldn't tell an ad from just regular content. And so what happened was the media got a hold of this, and there was all the normal sort of hand-wringing and hair-pulling that you would expect. So the kids can't manage their online environment, like they don't know anything, like all this kind of stuff was going on. But what was interesting to me is that there were subsequent Stanford studies, not only with students, but with PhD history professors and professional fact checkers. And what they found out was that the history professors, when given the same tasks as the undergraduate students to try to identify who was behind information online, did pretty much as badly as the students did. But the fact checkers were able to immediately, sometimes within 30 or 45 seconds, determine who was behind information. And so they came up with this process called lateral reading, which is what we're going to show you a little bit of today, that can be applied in classrooms, with students, with groups in the community, to teach you some of the tricks that fact checkers use to better analyze online information. So we'll get into that right now.
So today I'm going to show you an example of lateral reading. This is an example based on a presentation that I do about how to fight fake news like a pro. And that title is deliberate, and you'll see why in just a bit. So here's our outline for today. We're going to look at what lateral reading is. We'll cover the 3 key questions that are related to lateral reading. I'll give you some tips from professional fact checkers. We'll do a live reading example, and I'll share some extra tips and tricks to make this easier for you. Let's start at the beginning. What is lateral reading? So lateral reading is using the web as a web to get information about unfamiliar sites, photos, videos, social media posts, anything that you might come across online that you are not familiar with. It involves quickly leaving the original source to find out about it by using other sources. The idea here is to use the web as sort of, as what it is, as a network of additional information that you can use to sort of situate yourself in the online environment. So why do we want to do this? Why do we want to read laterally to get a sense of what we're looking at online? Reading laterally is not just about fighting fake news. It's a way to search smarter and faster for any information that you are not familiar with. It saves you time, and it makes you smarter by focusing on more efficient ways to learn. So instead of just sort of taking a deep dive into an unfamiliar website, using lateral reading, immediately jumping off an unfamiliar site to look at what other sources say about it, will help you sort of build a network of reliable sources that you can use to analyze unfamiliar information. The idea is to get your bearings around unfamiliar content. So figuring out where the content you're looking at fits into the larger, what a librarian would call information ecosystems. And it's especially important from my perspective and from the perspective of working with teachers who are then going to work with students and working with teacher librarians. Print analysis strategies don't work with digital content. So all of the things that we have, and I have as a librarian and as a teacher at the university, all these things that we tell students to do, deep reading, all the things we were taught to do as students, they don't work in this new environment. They're not useful for really critically analyzing digital content. So learning a new way of reading that adapts to the environment that we're in is really helpful. I think this is a really important point. Digital content is not going to tell you that it's lying. You can take the deepest dive into a website that you are not familiar with, and it is not going to tell you that the information is fake or that there's an agenda behind the information, especially in this environment where clicks matter and sharing and interaction. If you spend a lot of time in content that is mis or disinformation, all you're doing is sort of feeding their data machine. So these are some really important points. And these can all be adapted, I think, into the classroom. So they're not just things for you to do yourself, but they're things to talk to your students about as you are getting them familiar with how to navigate information online, because that's where they live. That's where we all live anymore. So working through some of these questions with them will help them understand not only what lateral reading is, but why they should do it. So, lateral reading focuses on asking and trying to find answers to three key questions. First, who is behind this information? That is the initial question that you should ask anytime you are confronted with information that is unfamiliar. Don't focus so much on trying to understand the content. That is often a way to get sucked into the site or sucked into argumentation that is not actually going to give you a lot of information about what you are reading. So ask yourself, who created this? Who is behind this information? The second question is, what is the evidence in this information that is supporting the arguments made here? So this can be really tricky, especially because some of those old ways of analyzing a website that we tell students to do, look for scientific information, look for charts and graphs, look for links to outside sources, look for bibliographies. Those things should not be taken at face value. So when we say, what is the evidence to support the claims being made here? This is sort of a higher level question. And it leads into our third question, which is, what do other sources say about this source? This is a really interesting distinction. Again, thinking about the source, not the content necessarily. And so in some ways, it goes right back to that question number one. Who is behind this and what do other people say about them? This is a form of what librarians often call triangulating information, right? Can you find other sources that support the information that you're looking at? But in this case, what you're trying to get a sense of is, what do other people say about the source itself? Not about the individual or the content within the source, but the actual website or newspaper or news agency. And that's it. Those are your only three questions guiding you in lateral reading. So you can see from these questions that it is really a critical thinking process as much as it is a skill set. It requires that you have a sense of what is good information, right? Like, what are other reputable sources? And we talk a little bit about what that looks like. But this is also why I think it's really useful to teach this kind of thing in schools. Here are some tips from professional fact checkers. And the reason that we say fighting fake news like a pro is that professional fact checkers are able to spot mis and dis and malinformation, suspect websites faster than students or professors, right? So they have a set of skills that have translated into this lateral reading project that are very useful, effective, and efficient. First, don't trust traditional credibility markers. And by credibility markers, I mean things like the About Us page on a website, references that might be included in a web article or on a web page, author credentials, and domain names as they appear on the page. So remember, the content is not going to tell you if it's lying. I still hear people say, well, you should go to a .org instead of a .com. And the truth is, you can buy a .org as easily as you can buy a .com. It doesn't signify anything about the content or the person or organization that owns that site. So when we teach students to blindly trust a .org over a .com, we're doing them a disservice. Author credentials is a little bit trickier. It requires a little bit more critical thinking. If you are not familiar with an author, for example, and that person has PhD or MD or some other sort of credentials after their name on the page, don't take that at face value. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now as we look at the different forms of health information and misinformation that is being shared, including by medical professionals. And so do a little bit of extra homework and look at who the author of a blog post or who an article or the author of an article is. References themselves, again, don't necessarily indicate that something is scholarly or academic or reputable. If an article includes a long list of references, but they link out to other suspect sources, or they link in a circular way back to the website itself, and you're just looking to see if there are references, you're going to miss a very important point, which is that this information is maybe not so credible. And then the About Us page, right? There's nothing that says you have to be honest in your About Us page. There's nothing that says you don't have to be vague in your About Us page. So these are all things, and I've taught them. So I'm coming at this from a perspective of someone who has told students to look for all these things. That if you see an About Us page, you know that someone's putting their name behind the information. That's not true so much anymore. And what we're doing with these traditional credibility markers is teaching students what the Stanford history education group that came up with lateral reading calls a checklist mindset, right? We're teaching students to approach unfamiliar information with this checklist. Does it have an About Us page? Check. Does it have references? Checked. Does the author have a PhD? Check. But all of those things don't necessarily add up to a good source. So my recommendation and what I've been telling librarians is to throw that checklist mentality out the window. It doesn't serve students. And in fact, research from Stanford shows that when students apply, when they know these credibility markers and they try to apply them, they actually do worse at evaluating websites than when they learn how to read laterally. The second tip is leave the site. Fact checkers spend, I think, some spend less than 30 seconds on an unfamiliar site because they know that looking for all these credibility markers is not going to get them any closer to understanding whether the site is reliable or not. It's going to take a lot more time and be a lot less efficient than just leaving the site to see what other people have to say. What they do is very simple. They will Google the site and then something like funding or information or controversy as keywords. They'll Google the name of the site or the name of the organization, and they'll go through their Google results, right? But they won't trust the first results on Google, right? So Google works on algorithms that are a mystery to the general population on purpose. And so, trusting the first things that come up on Google don't necessarily provide the best information. So they are looking for other reputable sites that talk about the site that they are unfamiliar with. When we talk about reputable sites, we're talking about things like reputable news agencies. So those are places that do fact checking, separate their newsrooms from their opinion desks, issue corrections when they make a mistake, things like that. I am a huge fan of the controversy or the criticism sections on Wikipedia pages. Now, I have heard teachers tell students not to use Wikipedia, and I'm going to advise you to leave that mentality behind when it comes to lateral reading. Wikipedia can be a great way to get your bearings on the web. I'm not saying you need to stop there, but certainly don't bypass it. Fact checkers use Wikipedia a lot and reference librarians use Wikipedia a lot to get a quick general sense of information that they're totally unfamiliar with. So it is not a bad tool to use. And then use smart keywords when you're searching. So if you're on an unfamiliar website, you could type in the name of the website and then funding, or fact checkers often use who is behind this website to see if they can bypass a lot of extraneous information and get right to who is doing the funding of a website. My hot tip, always put phrases in quotation marks. It helps the search engine understand the phrase as a phrase. It's never going to hurt your search to do that, and it will often help your search. So anything, would tell my students, anything that's more than 2 words, like who is behind, put it in quotation marks. I want to show you a quick live example that came out of the Stanford History Education Project research. And this is an example of something that you could do with your students. You might not necessarily, depending on the age of your students, want to use the 2 sites that I'm going to show you, but you could easily find two versions of information, unfamiliar information for your students that would work at their age level and be able to do something like this in the class. And I am also through Humanities Montana, if you wanted me to come and do something like this with your students or as an in-service with your teachers or teacher librarians, I would be happy to do something like this as well. So this is an example of, if we were in a computer classroom, something that I would have you do on your own to see if we could figure out who is behind the information. So I'm going to use, you're seeing my screen now, I'm going to use 2 websites that the Stanford History Education Center used for doing this study with their students. So the first is the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the second is the American College of Pediatricians. So these 2 sites were given to Stanford undergraduates and Stanford history professors, and they were asked to determine which was the more reputable site. If you look at these sites, they're both professional associations. So they have their logos. We have the logo up here on the American Academy of Pediatrics. We have the logo for the American College of Pediatricians. There's contact us pages, news, topics. About us is front and center. About us is front and center on both of these, right? So all of those things that we teach students to look at are here. But if I'm presented with these pages, I don't want to spend any time looking at those things, right? I don't want to spend any time trying to dig a deep dive into these pages. What I'm going to do is open another window on my computer, and I'm going to do a search for, let's start with American Academy of Pediatrics. Well, let's just start with that and see what comes up. So obviously the first thing that's going to come up is their own page. Their Twitter page comes up next, some secondary websites. So I already feel like I may be spending too much time. I don't know what any of these other websites are, right? They're pointing back to their own site, which is not super useful for me. So I'm going to go ahead and you'll see over on the right here, I'm going to go ahead and go over to Wikipedia and see what they say. It is a misunderstanding that anybody can jump in and edit a Wikipedia page, right? There are levels of editing. Wikipedia flags things, right? That may seem like an advertisement. Treat Wikipedia as you would any other source, right? What we're looking for here is a general sense of what this organization is about. I'm not interested in the content of their page right now. I just want to figure out who they are. So right away, I can see on the right here, they're 91 years old. So they've been around for quite a while. In the content section, I'm often looking for things like sections that will say controversy or criticism or something like that. So we know here it's a professional organization. Founded in 1930, has 67,000 members. Okay, so I'm getting, so it has the largest publishing pediatric program in the world. This gives me a little bit of a sense, right? I don't know a lot, but I know more than I did, right? So it's a professional organization. It's almost 100 years old, and it has a membership of 67,000 members and a large publishing program. I'm going to do the same thing with the American College of Pediatricians and see what comes up. You'll notice here they come up, their organization is the first link, of course. The second link here is a little bit more interesting than with the American Academy of Pediatricians. So I'm seeing the Southern Poverty Law Center. And right away from this slug here, I can see that the SPLC is calling this a fringe anti-LGBT TQ hate group, okay, that masquerades as a U.S. association. Okay, so already I have more information than I did before. I'm going to take a look at their Wikipedia page. American College of Pediatricians is a socially conservative advocacy group. That doesn't necessarily raise any red flags for me, although it's interesting to me that this is brought up in the first sentence, whereas it wasn't here. This was just called a professional association. Although this has its own red flags, right? Contains articles that are written like an advertisement. So let's see. This group was founded in 2002. Okay, so already we know that it's much younger than the American Academy of Pediatricians. This is old data. So this is interesting to me as well. It has between 150 and 200 members. So this is information that is useful. The fact that the data are old makes me a little suspicious. And then it gives some information here. The group's primary focus is advocating against abortion, the adoption of children by gay and lesbian people, and conversion therapy. I'm already getting information here that is very useful in determining these two sites that I'm not familiar with. And right down here, we see the founding and membership. The group was founded by a past president of the AAP as a protest against their support for adoption. So this tells me that this American College of Pediatricians seems to be a splinter group from the larger national organization. I could go deeper in looking at their positions and at their publications. I could take a look at some of this stuff down here. Somebody saying that pediatrician has accused them of mischaracterizing his research. But I found out what I need to know. If I were a fact checker, and this is what the fact checkers did, they were able to determine that this website for the American College of Pediatricians is less reputable than the American Academy of Pediatrics, that it has an agenda that's not necessarily made clear on their website. And so the thing to remember with this is that lateral reading is is a tool to give you more information. It's not necessarily a way to say, bam, something is bad, right? Or something is good. The question that the researchers were trying to get the students and the professors and the fact checkers to answer was, which of these two sites is more reliable? The American College of Pediatricians is not going to tell you that it is a splinter group of 200 members broken off from a large parent organization over issues like adoption by LGBT couples or conversion therapy or other agendas that have been scientifically sort of debunked. The question is, how can I get more information to better deal with this website? Now, I may still want to use this website for something. I may still want to use this website to figure out what what their positions are on certain issues. If I'm writing a paper on, to argue for or against something, but I want to know what I'm looking at. And until I read laterally, I don't know what I'm looking at. So that's where these Wikipedia pages come in a really handy way. Now, if I were going to do this, or if you were going to do this in a meeting or in a classroom, you could sort of replicate what the Stanford study did. You could give high schoolers, for example, high school seniors, these two websites and ask them what they could find out about them, and then have a discussion about what they learned and what that tells them about the information that they're looking at. So you can do this with any kind of sites where you have this differentiation between information. There are other sites that Stanford used that you could easily use in the classroom. And if you're interested in looking more in depth about what Stanford did and looking at some of the free curricula that they offer to teachers, go ahead and look up the Stanford History Education Group Center for Civic Online Reasoning, and you'll find a lot of resources. They're also linked at the end of this presentation. You'll find a lot of resources to use in your classroom. So that's a really quick example of lateral reading. And I will fully admit to you that it seems simple, right? It seems kind of like a no-brainer, like, oh, hop over to Wikipedia and see if you can get a little background information and then put on your thinking cap to analyze that information, right? But people don't do it. People don't do it that well. And so teaching students to jump off an unfamiliar site is a skill that they don't have, right? Instead, what we've taught them is to do a deep reading of unfamiliar sites. And when the Stanford students were trying to analyze sites, they were doing exactly what they had been taught to do, which was look at the domain, look at the about us, right? See if we can figure out, let me just go back really quickly, right? Look at this page, right? They jump right into information about what's best for children, right? The American Academy of Pediatricians, right? This center section here, preparing your practice for COVID-19 vaccine, that is not an ad, but it looks like an ad, right? This page is nowhere near as professional looking as what we have over here, right? All the stuff we taught students to look for, like stupid colors up here, right? Like bad web design, all this kind of stuff, right? This is a much cleaner page. It's much easier to navigate. And students also, because it's a .org, the students thought that it was the better web page. And they thought that because they were using the tools that we have given them to analyze sites. If we teach them different ways to deal with the online environment, they will be better able to handle unfamiliar information that comes across their phones or their computer screens. And again, you saw me here just use Wikipedia. I cannot emphasize enough. Do not steer your students away from Wikipedia. Teach them how to use it effectively. So a few more tips to wrap up here. Open new tabs. So you'll notice that what I did was I didn't open a whole bunch of new windows. I didn't close the windows I was looking at for those two websites. I just opened new tabs using these shortcuts. And so everything I had, all the searching I was doing was right on my screen. And that's part of why it's called lateral reading, right? You're moving across your screen to to build a network of other sites to tell you about your initial one. When you leave the site, don't close that window, just open up new tabs. I fully admit to sounding like a broken record on this, but I have heard too many teachers and too many librarians telling students not to use Wikipedia. That is an archaic way of dealing with information. Teach them how to use it instead. Look for sections on controversy or criticism. Use it down in their references to bump out to other sites to see who they have cited. Fact checkers use Wikipedia. It is in the process of lateral reading, it is a good tool for getting your bearings. Build a trusted network of sites. So this is where you have a real opportunity in working with kids that those of us who work with adults have a little bit of a more difficult time with, right? You can teach your students what is a trusted website, what is a trusted news resource, right? You can help them build that network. And this is one of the things that fact checkers have sort of in their bag of tricks, right? They, Southern Poverty Law Center caught my eye right away, right? Now they have their own controversy and criticism that swirls around them. But as a site to look at, I know that it is, I'm going to go ahead and call it a reputable organization, not without its own criticisms and controversies, but it did give me sort of that red flag that I wouldn't necessarily have gotten just looking at the website. Snopes is a great source if for sort of busting myths online. PolitiFact is a great source. I know that some people don't like using, there's a chart online called the Ad Fontes media bias chart. I know some people don't like using that. I find it useful to figure out sort of what the most neutral sources out there are, right? Like go to Reuters, go to the Associated Press, build a list of sites that you trust to see what you can find, and teach students as part of your lateral reading teaching. And this is where the Stanford curriculum that's freely available online can really come in handy for you to teach some of these skills to your students. Here are some of the references that I have used. These Breakstone and McGrew and Weinberg articles are absolutely excellent. The majority of them are written for teachers. They're really accessible. I think that the Stanford History Education Group does a great job of talking to people who are in the field practicing these things, right? So these are not heavy academic articles. These are really, really useful tools for getting a sense of what lateral reading is and how you might be able to adapt it into your classrooms.
So now we're in the Q&A part?
Yeah.
Okay.
So those are really interesting examples, and thanks for kind of walking us through how it works and demonstrating like that. I have so many questions. So one of them is just like, how is this different from what we've done before? Does this change how we teach information literacy?
From my perspective as a librarian, it totally changes how we teach information literacy, because in the past what we've done is taught this kind of checklist system that I was talking about in the PowerPoint, where you're looking at things like the About Us page, or whether you're looking at a .com or a .org, and those things just aren't applicable so much anymore. It's really easy to obscure information online, and a lot of the things that I used to teach students, like look at the graphic design, are there spelling mistakes, like that stuff has gone out the window, because really powerful lobby groups can easily create information that looks better than, legitimate sites. And so we're trying to move away from that checklist thing to get people to think about information in a better way.
And is this primarily for like library classes, information literacy classes, like computer classes in a high school?
I would say no. So I think that anybody can incorporate lateral reading into their curriculum across any subject. So I've seen videos of teachers and educators, using this in like a social studies class or something like that. And they say to students, okay, so we've got this information, now let's find out about the information. before we really move forward with talking about it, we need to get some context around the information. So it's actually a really easy skill to adapt into any of the classes that you're teaching where you're dealing with information, where students might be coming across something online that you want them to know a little bit more about. So you're teaching them the skill in a really organic way. I think it can be used as sort of a standalone information literacy session in a library, but I think it's better to be integrated into whatever the topic is, because it's not, we don't want to treat it like a standalone topic. It's a way of finding out information regardless of the subject. So
Would that include social media?
yes, it totally includes social media. So
Anything that you find on Facebook or Twitter or any of the social feeds that you're using, you can read laterally to figure out, who's behind this information. That's the main question. Who is behind this? And the idea is once you get a sense of who's behind the information, you can it gives you a better sense of what their agenda might be. And so the thing with social media is a lot of times we'll believe things because our friends will share them with us. We're like, well, I know Sam is behind this post and I trust Sam. But if you haven't done a lateral check, you might be sharing something that is maybe not the best information, and you're not doing it on purpose, but you just don't know. So it's a great tool for like taking that one extra step and saying, how can I figure out a little bit more about this so that I can make a better judgment about how I want to use this information?
Okay, but if I'm on social media, I'm on Facebook or Instagram, and I'm scrolling through, this sounds like it's going to take a lot of time. I don't know that I have the time to do lateral reading checks on everything on social media.
Yeah.
Or even if I'm trying to write a paper for a class, how much time is this going to take?
it's a great question. What the Stanford study found is that people who are really good at lateral reading can get to the essence of the information within, I think the range is about 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So once you build the habit, it actually is a really quick process. It's a lot quicker than sort of diving into a web page and saying, do I think that this is legitimate, by trying to read what's in the web page. Like some of the history professors and the Stanford students that were part of this study would spend huge amounts of time trying to look at a page to determine if it's legitimate or not. Whereas the fact checkers could immediately jump off the site that they weren't familiar with and get some context there. So it will take some time when you start, and individuals and students who are learning this, it's like anything, it's a practice. But once you develop the practice, it's a lot easier and quicker to sort of get your bearings in the online world.
Okay. You've almost got me. But next, will it tell me which sites are good and which ones are bad?
That's a great question. So it won't. And in a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, that's not the point, right? We want it to do that, but the idea is to give you context, not necessarily an answer. So there may be some sites that you immediately recognize as bad or bogus or misinformation. But the idea is more, can I find out a little bit more so that I can make a better judgment about this information? So it's not like a cure-all for like finding fake news and zapping it. It's very much giving yourself, it's a critical thinking process, and that still requires like the thinking part. So.
Okay, so one of the other terms that I've heard you talk about is confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And it sounds kind of like if it's not going to tell me which sites are good and bad, and I have confirmation bias, this isn't really going to help.
Yeah, it's a great question, and as you know, one of the presentations that I do for schools or for individuals around the state is on confirmation bias.
Can you define that just a little?
Yeah, confirmation bias is basically believing something is true because it matches what you already think.
And also like looking for information that agrees with you so that you can use it to prove your point. So if you're looking for something, you'll find it, basically, with confirmation bias. The thing with confirmation bias and lateral reading is that what I always tell people is if you immediately agree with something, that's when you should take a step back and say why. So the thing with confirmation bias is knowing you have it is the best way around, right? So it's a process of being aware of what your own biases are when you're doing the lateral reading. So if you are immediately drawn to something that proves your point, you probably want to take a step back, even in the lateral reading process, and say, okay, do I agree with this because I agree with it, or do I agree with it because it's a reputable source? So it's really tricky. There's no like, there are always going to be people who agree with stuff because they want it so badly to be true. And lateral reading and confirmation bias don't fix that. That's a cognitive issue, not an information issue. So the thing with lateral reading is just being, and with confirmation bias, is being very conscious of both things so that you're not just absorbing information because you happen to agree with it.
I think one time you said, look for what disproves your argument or your point or your belief.
Yeah, that's a great way to get around confirmation bias. And I used to talk to students about this when I taught at the university. I would say, you know what, if you can find the argument against your argument, you can figure out the holes in your own argument. And so it's a good way of sort of challenging yourself without having maybe a really intense confrontation with another person, right? So taking that time just in the privacy of your own online searching to say, well, what is the alternate argument for this? And if nothing else, you at least understand it better. You don't have to be convinced, you don't have to change your mind, but that's a good way of helping you like really think about why you have the position that you do, or why you believe the information that you do, and what else might be out there to challenge that.
So we're talking about lateral reading and confirmation bias, but I know that your programs are even more extensive than that. What else? I mean, I feel like we could do an hour on each of these, but what else can you do if you're like actually in a classroom? And what does it look like when you're not on video like this, but you're actually in a room with kids?
So some of the, I do one on confirmation bias. I've got one on how do you recognize sponsored content, because a lot of students like think they're seeing things, but they're not realizing that they're just getting advertisements like shoved at them all the time. How to recognize a fake image, which are everywhere out there on the web. How to figure out like how to follow the money, basically, behind web content. So there's all these, it's sort of like a menu that teachers can choose from to tailor to what they're doing in their classroom, what they think is most relevant for their students. In the classroom, my way of interacting is especially with students, is to try to get them involved. So when we do the confirmation bias thing, we do this exercise where I actually walk them through. I sort of trick them into having a confirmation bias, and they don't realize what's going on. I think we've done this together, right? This is the number pattern, yeah, where you're looking. It's called the Wasson Rule Discovery Test. And
will you say that again?
The Wasson Rule Discovery Test.
Okay.
And nobody ever gets what's going on, which is fantastic. And then as soon as you make the big reveal, like, people are trying to find patterns that match what they think the pattern is, when what they should be doing is trying to figure out what breaks the pattern of these numbers. This all sounds really vague right now, but in the classroom, it's a lot of fun with students, and actually with adults too. So we do a lot of that interaction, and then I give them some time to say, okay, what does this tell you? Like, how would you do something different now that you know the trap that you just fell into? And then with adults or older students, we like to ask them, like, and they don't necessarily have to share, but what are some of the things that you feel strongly about that might trip you up when you're looking at online information, that might make you easily believe, so that they can apply it in their own lives, I work with the speakers in the school program with my sister, who's a licensed educator in Montana. And so she's put together a lot of really good lesson plans that then teachers or teacher librarians can use after the fact to sort of do the same thing with other classes that we don't get to on that day. And which is, I should say, with the Speakers in the Schools program, one of the things that I am really a fan of is doing like professional development or in services with teachers, because then they can sort of branch out into their districts or into their school and apply these things where they think it best fits throughout the curriculum, instead of, you know, having somebody come in for each individual class, although I'm happy to do that too, and it's worked great. So
you said that with lateral reading there's no checklist, that we've really moved away from the checklist, but is there like a big takeaway or like a main lesson if you've watched this 50-minute video, and like what do you want people to, like, what do you want to stick in people's heads?
I think for me, the thing that I want people to remember is that the web is a web, right? And it there's a lot of information out there that can help you. The Stanford researchers call it getting your bearings, to figure out where you are basically in the network of the web. And one of the things they found with the study they did is that they would give the students and the professors these websites, and they never left them. They never got off them. They spent all their time trying to figure out by looking at the site if it was true. So I think the big takeaway for me is use the web as a web. Like, don't spend a lot of time on something that you're not familiar with. Jump off it right away and think about these sort of big three questions. Who's behind it? What's the evidence? What do other sources say? So that to me would be the takeaway, that you have at your disposal all of this other information that can help you make better choices. So use it. Use it. Don't just rely on what happens to be on your screen in front of you.
That was kind of a revelatory idea for me. I thought I was using the web as a web when I was like clicking links on a page and going deeper. I felt like that it was like webbing and spreading.
Yeah.
I was, getting all of these different things. But after learning more about lateral reading, that's really not. That's going down,
yes.
Not sideways.
Exactly. And so that's, the Stanford researchers call that vertical reading, right? Because you're going deeper and deeper. And the thing with links and connections like that is that they could be linked, you would have to then laterally read for every single one of those to make any sense out of it, because people can link to their own research or to other sort of maybe not great quality sources. And so you're just digging deeper and deeper. And the other thing that you're doing when you do that is you're racking up data for the website, right? So you're showing people that you're really deeply engaging with the website, when maybe it's a site that you don't want to be deeply engaging with. So there's this whole other side of it that for me as a librarian is really interesting. Like, who are you sharing your data with? Whose numbers are you racking up so that then they can get more advertising money? It's a whole big mesh of economic sort of tangle. But yeah, when you jump off, that's when you're doing the lateral reading. So and what you just described, that way of reading, is what we were taught to do in school, right? I mean, I was taught to read deeply and to read really carefully. And that's what the Stanford history students and professors were doing. They were really, really carefully reading. It's not that they didn't know how to use the internet. They were using it like a print text. So they were doing exactly what we've taught them to do. And the trick is to teach them to do something differently. This is why I think Stanford's research is so interesting, and people take it the wrong way, like students just don't know how to use the web. Well, they don't, because they weren't taught how to do it. So if we teach them how to do it, then they have some skills that will make them better consumers of information.
I love these conversations with you. I feel like we go on these tangents, but I always learn something new.
I know.
And yeah, thank you. Thanks for being part of Speakers in the Schools and
Yeah.
doing this all over Montana. Too.
No, thank you guys. I love doing it, and I love working with the students. And I mean, I'm biased as a librarian, but to me, this is like the issue of our age, right? How are we going to take control of our information environment?